What's going on, guys? It's Jimmy here. Welcome to our daily show where we discuss everything going on here in our country that you need to know about here on a daily basis. We got some major stuff here for you guys in this video. If you're new to our channel or if you haven't yet, make sure to click the subscribe button down below so you don't miss out on new videos. It's completely free to do so. And also, thanks so much for liking and sharing these videos. Let's jump right in. We got a lot to talk about. Okay, so first up, a lot of people wondering why the U.S. didn't get former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan in the prisoner swap for the Merchant of Death in exchange with the Russian exchange for Britney Griner, the U.S. Gold medalist, two-time gold medalist, women's basketball player. Well, we're learning more. Take a look. Yeah, you could see here, U.S. National Security Council Chief Kirby says that Russia would not release Paul Whelan in prisoner swap. Remember, I mentioned this here yesterday that Paul Whelan had really bad-mouthed Russia in his trial, saying that Russia basically was a scam and that they had captured and convicted him with no evidence, and they did it on purpose so that they could prisoner exchange him and really badmouth them when during the trial. And maybe that's the reason, maybe not. Also, don't forget he's convicted of espionage. So the thing about that is that maybe they don't want to release him for that reason. Remember that Britney Griner was really released or really convicted on a very minor incident. It's a hashish oil, which is basically like CBD oil mixed with a little bit of more potent stuff. Um, Here in the U.S., it's like it wouldn't even be illegal in a lot of places. It's so minor. They try to give her 8 years for that. Now compare that to espionage. That's a two completely different things here. And then on top of that, he badmouthed Russia. Um, that's a completely different things. Also, Paul Whelan, don't forget, he was discharged from the Marines for larceny. So he has a checkered past as well. In fact, here is the directly from John Kirby himself from the White House. Here's what he has to say. Take a listen.
Joining us now, Rear Admiral John Kirby, the coordinator for strategic communications at the National Security Council. Welcome back to Fox News Sunday, Admiral.
Thank you, Shannon. Good to be with you this morning.
Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, you had a conversation with my colleague Martha McCallum. It was in the context of Apple and what it's doing in China. You said this: we aren't in the business of telling private companies how to execute their initiatives. But it appears from these revelations from inside of Twitter, there were regular meetings between executives there, the FBI, DHS, the DNI. Flagging tweets, expressing their concerns, it seems trying to drive certain conversations. So should or shouldn't the federal government, federal agencies, in your words, be directing private companies on how to execute their initiatives?
We aren't directing private social media companies on how to manage their content. These are decisions that they have to make as appropriate. Now, look, we obviously don't want to see the public square polluted with hate speech and disinformation. That's not a good use of the information environment for the American people. But it's up to these social media companies to determine how they're going to manage their content, how they are going to deliver that content to their users.
But how much pushback ability do they have if the federal government, an agency like the FBI, is calling them up and saying, we don't like these specific tweets and think you should take action, and then they do, it appears?
Well, without speaking to that hypothetical situation, again, these are private companies, and they have to make these decisions based on their own policies, their own initiatives, and we respect that.
Okay, let's talk about the big news this week between Viktor Bout, the illegal arms merchant who was convicted of a number of things, was on a sentence here in the U.S., and he was traded for Britney Griner. I think all Americans celebrate and have great relief that she is home, but there are questions about exactly what went down there. NBC initially had reporting that said the White House was given a choice between Paul Whelan, a U.S. Marine who's being held on espionage charges by Russia, and Britney Griner, or no one. They said it was a misstatement. They corrected it later to say that it was either Britney Griner or no one. Can you unequivocally say that there was never an option between Paul Whelan or Britney Griner?
Yes, ma'am, I can. There was never a choice posed by the Russians, well, hey, you give us Bout back, and then you can decide whether you want Britney or Paul. That was never the arrangement. It was only Miss Griner for Mr. Bout. They treat Paul differently, Shannon, because of these sham espionage charges. He is put in a special category by the Russians, and try as we might, and believe me, Shannon, we did. Right up until the very end, we were making efforts to try to get both of them out. There was just no way to get there. So it was either make this deal now and at least get one of them home and keep up the efforts to get Paul home, and that's where we are right now.
I want to ask about Mark Fogel because he's a U.S. teacher. He's taught in Russia for, I think, more than a decade, roughly a decade or so. He was taken into custody in August of last year, also coming through an airport there, had medical marijuana with him that was prescribed by a doctor because of injuries and surgeries that he's been through. He's been sentenced to 14 years. He obviously doesn't have the name recognition or the celebrity of a Britney Griner, but he's been held on similar charges for longer than she has. Why wasn't he part of this conversation or this deal?
There's a limit in this particular case about what I can say publicly. I can tell you we're obviously mindful of this, of course, but there are some constraints here in terms of what we can say publicly. I can just broadly say that when it comes to wrongful detentions of Americans around the world, overseas, whether it's Russia or anywhere else, we're going to work as hard as we can to get them home.
Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat, had this to say. He chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Russians and other regimes that take American citizens hostage cannot pretend that there is equivalence between the Britney Griners of the world and people like Viktor Bout, the so-called merchant of death. Nothing could be further from the truth, and we cannot ignore that releasing Bout back into the world is a deeply disturbing decision. Reaction out there from one of the former DEA regional directors who was part of putting him away found it astounding that he would be released. What kind of message does this send to our enemies, to bad actors out there who think if they've got an American, especially with any level of celebrity, they could get someone back like the, quote, merchant of death?
Sadly, this is a common tactic by Mr. Putin. We've seen this before. That's why the president has put in place additional accountability measures, visa restrictions, other sanctions that will give us a little bit more influence and ability to affect the decision making of potential hostage takers. We've also included on the State Department website for every country you want to visit, there's now a new designation which will let you know what the detention risk is if you want to travel to a certain country, whether it's for business or pleasure. So we urge Americans, if you're going to travel overseas, go look at that so you go fully informed. But know this, that even if you do everything right, and even if hostage takers are not dissuaded, that the United States government is going to do everything we can, if you're wrongfully detained overseas, to get you back home. And that might mean making some tough decisions, like the one the president just made. But in the end, the president believed it was the right thing to do to get to Britney Griner back home. And of course, there's no equivalence. She wasn't guilty of anything. It was a sham trial to begin with. Mr. Bout obviously was guilty on very serious charges.
Well, including charges that he would sell to terrorists and other people that would freely go around and happily kill Americans. So you can imagine there's great deal of worry about him being released back out into the mainstream. We've seen what's happened with some of the people we've traded in deals that have ended up back on the battlefront and in places of, leadership in terrorism organizations. Over on the House side, Guy Reschenthaler, the Republican, and the House says this: Biden and Secretary Blinken better preserve their documents because the new House majority, Republican majority, is going to demand answers on this latest disaster. So how will this administration answer the questions about why Mark Fogel and Paul Whelan were left behind?
We'll, of course, cooperate fully with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. If there's a need and a desire for more information, we'll be as forthcoming as we absolutely can be. Of course, we respect the role of Congress. A couple of points. Mr. Bout wasn't serving a life sentence, Shannon. He was going to get out in 2029. So at some point in the not-too-distant future, he would have been a free man. It is 6 years earlier. Nobody over at the White House is doing backflips of joy that he is walking the streets, but this was the deal we could get. Now was the moment we could get it. We're obviously going to look after our national security going forward, and Mr. Bout has choices to make. And if he chooses to get back into that line of work, then we're going to do everything we can to hold him properly accountable, as we have in the past. We did a national security assessment. We believe that that whatever risk there is was manageable and okay to make this deal.
Wow. Well, first of all, what an interview. Wow. Let me know your thoughts here on this. At this point, Paul Whelan, I'm not sure he will be released at all. I don't know if the U.S. has anybody to trade for him at all. And at this point, he might not be released anytime soon. You guys can let me know your thoughts here on this. They're holding him for espionage, whether they're real charges or not. Who knows the truth? I mean, if you are a spy, you're surely not going to tell anybody the real truth. And yeah, you guys can let me know your thoughts here on this. So on the other hand, you know, if you are an Olympian, let alone a gold medalist, but even if you're just an Olympian for our country, you would think it's the duty to the government to get you back, even if you're not. I mean, yeah, it's the duty of the U.S. to get you back, and obviously, the U.S. has brought other prisoners back in prisoner exchanges earlier this year as well. So this is kind of something they do periodically. So yeah, I mean, a lot of controversy over these things all the time. Also, here, the Pentagon chief says that Russia is modernizing and expanding its nuclear arsenal. Remember, they have about 6,000 nukes, as if they didn't have enough. They're working on more. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that Russia is, quote, modernizing and expanding its nuclear arsenal as its invasion of Ukraine continues, and Russian President Vladimir Putin has made threats about using nuclear weapons in the conflict. Austin spoke at a ceremony. The new head of U.S. Strategic Command, Stratcom, Anthony Cotton, the agency is responsible for strategic nuclear deterrence, nuclear operations, and missile defense. Cotton took over for Charles Richard. They acknowledged several challenges facing Stratcom in the near future, including the expanding Russian nuclear arsenal and Chinese nuclear forces that are growing, modernizing, and diversifying. Quote, and as the Kremlin continues its cruel and unprovoked war of choice against Ukraine, the whole world has seen Putin engage in deeply irresponsible nuclear saber rattling. So make no mistake, quote, nuclear powers have a profound responsibility to avoid provocative behavior and to lower the risk of proliferation and to prevent escalation and nuclear war. Also, Putin says here that Russia could adopt a U.S. preemptive strike concept. Here's what he says. Putin said Friday that Moscow could adopt what he describes as a U.S. concept of using preemptive military strikes against the U.S., noting that it has the weapons to do the job. In a blunt statement against rising Russian NATO tensions over Ukraine, he says, quote, we're just thinking about it. They weren't shy to openly talk about it during the past years, he says, referring to U.S. policy against Russia, as he attended a summit in Kyrgyzstan of a Moscow-dominated economic alliance of ex-Soviet nations. For years, the Kremlin has expressed concern about U.S. efforts to develop the so-called conventional prompt global strike capability, that envisions hitting an adversary's strategic targets with precision-guided conventional weapons anywhere in the world within 1 hour. Putin says, quote, speaking with about a disarming strike, maybe it's worth thinking about adopting the ideas developed by our U.S. counterparts, their ideas of ensuring their security. Putin said with a thin smile, noting that such a preemptive strike was intended to knock out command facilities. He claimed that Russia already has commissioned hypersonic weapons capable of carrying out such a strike, while the U.S. hasn't yet deployed them. He also claimed that Russia now has cruise missiles that surpass their U.S. equivalents. Putin says if the potential adversary believes that it can use the theory of a preemptive strike, and we don't, it makes us think about the threats posed by such ideas in other countries' defensive posture. And this is where you got to kind of think about this and relate this back to how much this war that Russia initiated, invading Ukraine, and the world, the US and Europe, the EU, and all the countries that have basically helped Ukraine defend themselves, has really depleted Russia, their missile stock, all of their troops that have been wounded or, literally incapacitated or, are gone. How much this has hurt their army. Because, I mean, look at how they talk about against the U.S. They have threatened the United Kingdom, saying that they could send a nuclear missile and wipe out the whole United Kingdom within 2 minutes. They've sent out these type of threats to the U.S., to the U.K., all of Europe, which is why we've all basically stopped buying their oil because we can't keep supporting a madman. So, yeah, if anything, this has significantly weakened their army, and we haven't had to put boots on the ground. Really, we've just supplied Ukraine with defense for their own country. And remember, we've basically done this with only about 5% of our defense budget. Remember, our new defense budget for the year, it's like $850 billion. That's what we spend on our country every single year. Every single year. They're going to be spending that again this year just for the U.S. So when they send like $40 billion to Ukraine, it's a sliver of what the U.S. spends every year for the defense of our country, whether we're in peacetime, wartime, or anything. And look at kind of the decimation that it's done to Russia and their stockpile of weapons and their troops. I mean, they just had to recruit 300,000 new people of people that weren't even in their army and train them. They had no military experience or anything. They had to draft people in against their will that weren't even combat people. They were drafted. So, I mean, you guys can let me know your thoughts here on this, but this is like Putin literally like threatens the U.S. and the rest of the world on a weekly basis. Now, hopefully, these are threats that don't materialize, but I mean, they are things to be concerned about. So I'll keep you up to date here with everything going on here in our country on a daily basis. If you're new here, make sure to click the subscribe button down below so you don't miss out on new videos. I'll keep you up to date here with everything. Click the bell icon after you subscribe. And also, thanks so much for liking and sharing these videos. You can click here to watch my newest video next, or you can click here to see a video the White House says you need to watch. Click on one of those videos next. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.